Welcome to How Bizarre. How Bizarre. Welcome. In this episode, we'll be returning to the vampire theme, but this time we'll talk about all things Dracula. So please get comfortable, and I hope you enjoy this episode. The Legend of Dracula: History, Myth, and Modern Influence. Dracula, the historical figure and the legend. The legend of Dracula is deeply rooted in history, folklore, and popular imagination. The name Dracula is most famously associated with Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, Dracula, but its origins stretch back centuries to the historical figure of Vlad III, also known as Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, and the vampire myths that circulated in Eastern Europe. Who was Vlad III? Vlad III was a 15th century prince of Wallachia, a region of modern-day Romania. Born in 1431 in Transylvania, he was a member of the House of Draculești, a branch of the Basarab dynasty. His father, Vlad II Dracul, was a member of the Chivalric Order of the Dragon, a group dedicated to defending Christendom against the Ottoman Empire. The name Dracula means son of the dragon, derived from his father's title. Vlad III is best remembered for his brutal tactics, particularly his extensive use of impalement against his enemies, earning him the moniker Vlad the Impaler. His reign was marked by military conflicts with the Ottomans, internal power struggles, and an iron-fisted rule over Wallachia. He became a legendary figure due to his merciless punishments of criminals and traitors. Despite his cruelty, he is still considered a national hero in Romania to this day for his defense against Ottoman incursions. Besides the Transylvanian region, what are the other geographical locations associated with vampire beliefs? The lore tied to the land, geographical locations of the Dracula myth. Vampire myths are widespread across many cultures, but certain regions, particularly in Eastern Europe, have a deep-rooted connection to vampire lore. These myths often stem from pre-modern understandings of disease, decomposition, and superstition. Here are some of the most well-documented geographical locations with strong vampire traditions. Vampires in Transylvania and Wallachia, modern-day Romania. Transylvania, famously linked to Dracula, is the heartland of vampire legends. Romanian folklore speaks of the strigoi, undead spirits that return from the grave to torment the living. These spirits were often blamed for unexplained deaths, crop failures, and livestock illnesses. Historical cases of vampires in Romania include records from the 17th and 18th centuries that detailed exhumations during which time villagers would stake, burn, or decapitate suspected vampires. Romanian vampire superstitions included the use of garlic, iron, and crosses, which were believed to repel vampires. In addition, graves were sometimes watched by villagers for signs of disturbances of the undead crawling to the surface to feed on the living. That sounds terrifying. Can you imagine being the unlucky villager that drew the short straw and got stuck watching a potential vampire grave alone at night? Sounds like the makings of a great movie to me, but I digress. Today, Transylvania capitalizes on its vampire legacy, with Bran Castle, often misattributed as Dracula's castle, being a major attraction. Vampires in Serbia and the Balkans. Serbia has one of the earliest recorded cases of vampire hysteria in Europe. The region's myths include the Vrikolakas, which are revenants who return to prey on the living. The case of Arnold Pale. A Serbian peasant, Arnold Pale, reportedly became a vampire after his death. His grave was exhumed, and villagers claimed to find his body undecomposed, leading to a wave of vampire panic across Europe in the 16th century. We've heard about witch trials, but were there vampire trials? Yes, government officials conducted formal investigations that documented vampirism as a public concern in the 18th century. Vampires in Bulgaria. Bulgarian vampire myths parallel those of Serbia and Romania, with entities known as Ustrel, vampire like creatures, and Karakonjul, night demons. Bulgarian vampires were believed to be formed from those who died unbaptized or in violent circumstances. Rituals to repel or protect against vampires included stakes, salt, and fire that were used to neutralize suspected vampires. Is there any evidence of these beliefs? Yes. Archaeological finds of the belief in vampires occurred in 2012 when Bulgarian archaeologists unearthed medieval skeletons with iron rods driven through their chests, suggesting ancient vampire slaying practices. Vampires in Greece. Greek vampire myths center around the Vrikalakas, an undead entity that could spread disease. Island legends. Greek island communities, including Crete and Santorini, had strong vampire traditions, often exhuming bodies if deaths occurred under mysterious circumstances. Orthodox Christianity often influenced vampire myths. Religious leaders played a role in suppressing vampire superstitions, though some priests performed exorcisms on suspected vampires. Vampires in Poland and Eastern Europe. Poland has some of the oldest documented vampire burials, dating back to the 16th century. Polish archaeologists have uncovered graves with skulls placed between the legs or weighed down with heavy stones, a known anti-vampire practice. Also, in the 17th century in the village of Zombki, accounts describe exhumations where villagers burned suspected vampires. Vampires in Germany and Western Europe. Although vampire legends are most associated with Eastern Europe, Germany also had a history of vampire beliefs. Here are a few examples. Blutsauger or bloodsuckers. German folklore depicted vampires as shape-shifting spirits that fed on humans. The Peter Plagojewicz case of 1725, a documented case in modern-day Austria, then part of the Habsburg monarchy, involved reports of a reanimated corpse killing villagers. Vampires in Russia and Slavic regions. Slavic folklore is filled with vampiric beings known as upiri or navi. The Russian Orthodox Church played a role in vampire beliefs, attributing cases of premature death to divine punishment. In these regions, villages often buried suspected vampires upside down or placed iron stakes in their graves. Vampires in China and East Asia, while vampires in the Western sense were rare in East Asian folklore, similar entities existed. Jiangshi, also called hopping vampires, in Chinese folklore, Jiangshi were reanimated corpses that absorbed life force rather than blood. Feng shui burial practices were important, with the thought that improper burials resulted in malevolent spirits returning. Vampires in the Americas. Vampire legends made their way to the Americas through European colonization. New England vampire panic, 19th century. In Rhode Island and Connecticut, tuberculosis outbreaks led to exhumations where bodies were burned to prevent the spread of vampirism. The case of Mercy Brown in 1892, one of the most famous American vampire cases, where the body of a young woman was exhumed and her heart was burned to prevent further deaths from her vampiric tendencies. Vampires in Africa and the Middle East. African and Middle Eastern vampire myths tend to focus on supernatural creatures that drain life energy. The Asanbazam of West Africa is a vampire-like creature that lived in trees and attacked at night. Impalement practices were performed in some African tribes as rituals similar to those in Eastern Europe to prevent spirits from returning. Vampires in India and South Asia. Indian folklore has multiple vampiric beings. The Baital is a spirit that possesses corpses and feeds on the living. The Churls are female spirits that drain the life force of men and are associated with their untimely deaths. The belief in vampires spans cultures and continents, often serving as an explanation for diseases, unexplained deaths, and burial anomalies. While Transylvania remains the most famous vampire associated region due to Dracula, the phenomenon is deeply rooted in many societies. Each culture developed its own methods of dealing with vampires, from iron stakes in Poland to fire rituals in New England. The universality of vampire myths suggests a shared human fear of the unknown, mortality, and the consequences of improper burials. Now that you see the broad reach of the vampire myth, let's return to Transylvania and Vlad III. How Vlad Tepes is viewed in the Transylvanian region from 1400 to 2025. The perception of Vlad the Impaler has evolved significantly over the centuries. While he was a feared and controversial figure in his time, his legacy has been reinterpreted in different historical, cultural, and political contexts. From the late medieval period to the modern era, Vlad III has been seen as a ruthless tyrant, a defender of Christianity, a source of national pride, and an inspiration for horror fiction. 15th to 17th centuries, villain or defender. During his lifetime and immediately after his death, Vlad III was both feared and revered. His brutal methods of governance, especially his use of impalement to deter crime and foreign invasion, were widely reported in both Wallachia and neighboring regions. In the Ottoman Empire and Western Europe, he was vilified as a bloodthirsty despot. German pamphlets and Slavic texts from the late 15th century depict him as a sadistic ruler who delighted in cruelty. However, within Wallachia and broader Romanian territories, Vlad III was also recognized as a strong leader who defended his land from foreign invasion, particularly the Ottomans. The church and local nobility respected his efforts to maintain order, even if his methods were extreme. The contradiction in his legacy, both hero and villain, was already forming. 18th to 19th centuries, nationalism and romanticism. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Vlad the Impaler's reputation began to shift. As Romania moved towards national unification and independence from foreign powers, Vlad III was increasingly seen as a national hero. His role in resisting Ottoman expansion aligned with 19th century nationalist movements that sought to reclaim Romania's historical identity. Romantic historians and poets portrayed Vlad as a defender of Romanian sovereignty. These reimaginings largely downplayed his cruelty and emphasized his tactical brilliance and unyielding defense of his homeland. During this time, accounts of his reign were often exaggerated to serve nationalistic purposes, transforming him from a controversial figure into a near mythological warrior. 20th century, communist propaganda and the Dracula connection. In the 20th century, Vlad III's image underwent further reinterpretation. Under Nicolae Ceausescu's communist regime, 1965 to 1989, Vlad was promoted as a model ruler who fought against corruption and foreign oppression. Communist propaganda reframed his actions as necessary to maintain stability and protect Wallachia from foreign invaders. He was depicted as a strong, decisive leader who exemplified the kind of authoritarian rule the government sought to justify. At the same time, Western perceptions of Vlad were largely shaped by Bram Stoker's Dracula. The 1931 Universal film, starring Bela Lugosi, and subsequent Hollywood adaptations cemented the association between Vlad and vampires. For many outside of Romania, Vlad the Impaler became synonymous with the supernatural Dracula, even though there is little historical evidence linking the two beyond the name. 21st century, modern interpretations and popular culture. Today, Vlad the Impaler's legacy is more nuanced than ever. In Romania, he is still regarded as a national hero by many, particularly those who emphasize his role in resisting the Ottoman Empire. However, his legacy remains controversial. While some historians celebrate him as a strategic genius, others acknowledge the undeniable brutality of his rule. Vlad III is also a key figure in Romania's thriving Dracula tourism industry. Bran Castle, often incorrectly associated with Vlad, has become a major tourist destination, with visitors drawn by the Dracula legend. His actual castle, Ponari Fortress, receives fewer tourists, but remains an important historical site. Beyond Romania, Vlad III continues to inspire books, films, and television shows. The historical Vlad was portrayed in Dracula Untold, 2014, which sought to merge history with vampire mythology. In academic and literary circles, his character is analyzed as an example of how historical figures can be mythologized to fit different cultural narratives. What is the cultural impact of the Dracula legend in Romania based on public opinion surveys? Recent surveys conducted in Romania reflect a divided but generally positive view of Vlad III. More than half of Romanians see him as a hero, primarily for his defense against the Ottomans. About a quarter of Romanians view him as a complex figure, acknowledging both his military successes and his brutality. Approximately 15% of Romanians consider him a villain, focusing on his extreme punishments and authoritarian rule. Additionally, modern Romanian historians emphasize that Vlad III should not be conflated with the fictional Dracula. Many Romanians are aware of how Western media has sensationalized their historical figure, and while they appreciate the tourism benefits, they often seek to correct historical misconceptions. In contrast, outside of Romania, Vlad III is still most commonly associated with the vampire myth. Despite academic efforts to distinguish the real Vlad from Dracula, pop culture continues to blur the lines between history and fiction. Modern persistence of the Dracula myth in Romania. Today, the Legend of Dracula remains a major cultural and tourist attraction in Romania. Bran Castle, often mistakenly referred to as Dracula's Castle, draws thousands of visitors each year. Vlad the Impaler's real stronghold, Ponari Castle, is less accessible but still a site of intrigue. Many Romanians view Vlad III as a historical figure rather than a vampire, but vampire tourism remains a thriving industry in Transylvania. Festivals, guided tours, and literature celebrating the Dracula myth continue to keep the legend alive, the vampire legacy that endures. Since the 15th century, Vlad the Impaler's image has continually evolved. In his lifetime, he was both feared and respected. In the nationalist movements of the 19th century, he was a symbol of resistance. Under communist rule, he was reframed as a model leader. Today, he exists as both a historical figure and a global legend, continuing to capture the imagination of scholars, tourists, and storytellers alike. His dual legacy, both hero and monster, ensures that Vlad III will remain a subject of fascination for generations to come. We've learned a lot about the historical context for the enduring vampire myth, but what were the vampire myths when Bram Stoker wrote Dracula? Vampire legends were widespread in Eastern Europe long before Bram Stoker's novel. These myths were fueled by pre-modern medical misunderstandings, reports of corpses appearing fresh after burial, and fears of the undead. The common characteristics of vampires included pale skin, nocturnal habits, and a thirst for blood. Some of the key vampire myths of the time included the Nosferatu, which was a Romanian term for an undead, blood-drinking entity, the Strigoi, which were restless spirits that could return from the dead to torment the living. The Moroi were similar to Strigoi, but were often associated with children who had died unbaptized. And last, but not least, were the Dhampir. The Dhampir were the offspring of a vampire and a human, often possessing supernatural abilities. These myths were strengthened by superstitions, such as burying corpses with garlic or a wooden stake through the heart to prevent the dead from rising. Now that we know the common vampire myths, let's move into the literature and take a bite out of a few classic books and movies on vampires. Dracula in popular culture, from Gothic horror to modern media, Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1897, was the pivotal moment when the historical and mythical aspects of Dracula merged into the iconic vampire character recognized today. However, Stoker was not the first to write about vampires, and his novel inspired countless adaptations and reinterpretations in literature, film, and television. Let's look into the early vampire literature. Before Dracula, vampire fiction had already begun to take shape. Some notable early works include The Vampire, 1819, by John Polidori. Considered the first modern vampire story, this short story introduced the aristocratic vampire figure in the form of Lord Ruthven. Varney the Vampire, 1845 to 1847, by James Malcolm Rymer and Thomas Prescott Prest, a serialized penny dreadful that introduced many later vampire tropes, such as fangs and hypnotic influence. Carmilla, 1872, by Sheridan Le Fanu, a novella featuring a female vampire with homoerotic undertones, influencing later portrayals of seductive vampires. And, of course, Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1897. Stoker's novel established many of the defining features of the Dracula legend. Using an epistolary format, the book follows Count Dracula's move from Transylvania to England and his battles with Professor Abraham Van Helsing and Jonathan Harker. Themes of sexuality, fear of the foreign, and Victorian anxieties about modernity are deeply embedded in the story. While Stoker's inspiration for Count Dracula remains debated, his research into Vlad the Impaler, vampire folklore, and Gothic literature undeniably shaped the novel. Dracula in early cinema. Dracula quickly became a staple in cinema, beginning with these landmark films: Nosferatu, 1922, a silent German expressionist film by F.W. Murnau, loosely based on Dracula, but changing names due to copyright issues. Count Orlok, played by Max Schreck, introduced a more monstrous portrayal of the vampire. Dracula, 1931. Starring Bela Lugosi, this Universal Studios film defined the classic Dracula look, with the Hungarian actor's suave, aristocratic portrayal becoming the standard. Horror of Dracula, 1958. Christopher Lee's portrayal in Hammer horror films gave Dracula a more overtly menacing and seductive quality. Who were the influential actors in Dracula films? Several actors left an indelible mark on Dracula films, shaping how audiences perceive the character. These actors include Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee, Max Schreck, Gary Oldman, and Frank Langella. Bela Lugosi was born in Austria-Hungary, in modern-day Romania. Lugosi was deeply superstitious and believed in spirits and the supernatural. His portrayal in the 1931 film defined Dracula for generations, and his distinct accent became synonymous with the character. The British actor Christopher Lee played Dracula in the Hammer horror series from 1958 to 1973. Lee also starred in The Wicker Man, 1973, a folk horror film that explored pagan rituals. His deep voice and imposing presence made him one of the most iconic Draculas in cinema. German actor Max Schreck played Count Orlok in Nosferatu, 1922. Schreck's mesmerizing portrayal of a Nosferatu was so unsettling that myths emerged that suggested he was indeed a real vampire. Another British actor, Gary Oldman, also portrayed Dracula in Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992. Oldman's depiction was stunning and brought a romantic and tragic depth to the role. The American actor Frank Langella portrayed the legend in Dracula, 1979. Langella added a sensual and aristocratic take to the character. These actors helped merge Dracula into the folk horror genre, especially Christopher Lee, whose role in The Wicker Man was integral to the British folk horror movement, blending supernatural and pagan elements with horror. What are some of the differences and similarities between Dracula film adaptations? Over the decades, different actors and directors have shaped Dracula's image in film. The following adaptations highlight key differences. In Nosferatu, 1922, Max Schreck is a grotesque, almost inhuman version of Dracula, with rat like features and an eerie, unnatural presence. This adaptation leans into the horror of the unknown and the monstrous. In Nosferatu, the Vampire, 1979, Klaus Kinski has a more melancholic and tragic take on Count Orlok. Kinski's Dracula is both horrifying and sorrowful, blending horror with elements of doomed romance. In Nosferatu, 2025, Bill Skarsgård's interpretation fuses elements from both Schreck's and Kinski's performances, bringing a modern intensity to the role. In Dracula, 1931, Bela Lugosi portrays the classic Dracula common to cinema today. Lugosi's portrayal cemented the image of Dracula as a charming, well-dressed aristocrat. This version played on the allure and danger of Eastern European mysticism. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992, Gary Oldman offered a richly layered and tragic interpretation. Oldman's Dracula is both terrifying and deeply romantic. This version focuses heavily on Dracula's backstory and his lost love, emphasizing Gothic romance. Each of these films reflects the cultural fears and aesthetic values of their time, whether focusing on the monstrous, Schreck, the tragic, Kinski, the romantic, Oldman, or the suave and seductive, Lugosi. Dracula wasn't the only vampire book that Bram Stoker wrote. Let's take a quick detour to discuss The Lair of the White Worm. In another of Bram Stoker's Gothic horror novels, The Lair of the White Worm, 1911, shares thematic elements with Dracula. It tells the story of a monstrous, ancient worm-like creature lurking in the English countryside, connected to dark folklore and vampiric horror. The novel was adapted into a 1988 film directed by Ken Russell, starring Hugh Grant. The story contains eerie imagery, serpentine symbolism, and themes of evil's persistence through history, echoing some of Dracula's supernatural elements. The novel and its adaptation have become cult favorites within the folk horror genre, further cementing Stoker's legacy beyond Dracula. Now let's look more into Dracula in literature and comics. Stoker's novel inspired numerous literary adaptations and expansions, including The Historian, 2005, by Elizabeth Kostova, is a novel that blends historical research with the Dracula myth. Dracula the Undead, 2009, by Dacre Stoker and Ian Holt, is a sequel, which is authorized by the Stoker estate. Marvel's Tomb of Dracula, 1972 to 1979, is a comic series featuring Dracula as a villain facing Blade, the vampire hunter. What are some modern film and television interpretations of Dracula? Dracula's influence expanded into contemporary media with numerous adaptations, including Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992. Directed by Francis Ford Coppola, this adaptation starred Gary Oldman and adhered closely to the novel while emphasizing romantic and tragic elements. Van Helsing, 2004. A film that recasts Van Helsing as a monster hunter battling Dracula and other classic creatures. Dracula Untold, 2014. A historical reimagining portraying Vlad the Impaler's transformation into Dracula. Netflix's Castlevania, 2017 to 2021. A series inspired by the video game franchise, featuring Dracula as a tragic figure. BBC's Dracula, 2020. a modern reimagining by Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat. Dracula in video games and popular culture. Dracula's presence in video games is equally significant. The Castlevania franchise, 1986 to present, features Dracula as the central antagonist, while other games like Skyrim and The Witcher also incorporate vampire lore inspired by Dracula. Dracula's influence extends into Halloween celebrations, Gothic fashion, and modern vampire literature, including Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles and Stephen E. Meyer's Twilight series. Over the centuries, Dracula has been portrayed in various ways, with interpretations reflecting the cultural beliefs and anxieties of their respective eras. These portrayals have differed in gender, personality, and appearance. As discussed previously, Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee, Gary Oldman, and other male actors have contributed heavily to our image of Dracula in movies. In addition, there have been several female Dracula characters. Carmilla, 1872, is one of the earliest female vampires, with themes of seduction and transgression. Countess Maria Zaleska in Dracula's Daughter, 1936, is a tragic female vampire who grapples with her identity and dark nature. The Brides of Dracula, present in various films, especially Hammer Horror's The Brides of Dracula, 1960, are seductive female vampires who often serve as Dracula's companions or victims turned hunters. In contrast, Selene in the Underworld series, 2003 to 2016, is a modern, empowered female vampire. Selene's presence shows a shift in cultural views towards strong female protagonists. Jessica DeGau's portrayal of Mina in Dracula TV series from 2013 is a female counterpart to Dracula in a modern television adaptation. What are the cultural reflections in gendered Dracula portrayals? In the 1700s to 1800s, male Dracula figures reflected fears of aristocratic dominance and foreign invaders. Female vampires, such as Carmilla, were linked to anxieties about female sexuality and gender roles. In the 1900s, male Draculas represented Old World mysticism and were depicted as both monstrous and seductive. Female vampires remained largely secondary, but were increasingly sexualized. Since the 2000s, gender roles in vampire fiction have evolved, with female Draculas taking on more active roles as both protagonists and antagonists, reflecting shifts in gender equality and representation in media. Now that you've learned about the history of Dracula and the different portrayals of Dracula in literature and media, let's take a step back into the world of folklore and learn about Dracula's enemy. Yes, even the Lord of the Undead has enemies to contend with. Dracula's nemesis, the role of Van Helsing in the Dracula myth. Professor Abraham Van Helsing is one of the most important characters in Dracula and vampire lore in general. He serves as the primary antagonist to Count Dracula, acting as a mentor and guide to the other protagonists in their quest to defeat the vampire. Van Helsing is depicted as an expert on obscure sciences, folklore, and medicine, making him the ideal foil to Dracula's supernatural menace. Why is Van Helsing essential to the Dracula myth? Van Helsing is a symbol of science versus superstition. Van Helsing embodies the Victorian struggle between rationality and the supernatural. While he is a man of science, he acknowledges the existence of forces beyond scientific explanation. Van Helsing as a protector of humanity. He represents knowledge, bravery, and resilience, ensuring that Dracula's reign of terror does not spread unchecked. Van Helsing is the first vampire hunter and sets the standard for vampire hunters in later literature and film, inspiring characters like Buffy, the Vampire Slayer, and Blade. With such a powerful persona, was Van Helsing based on a real person? Yes, maybe. I'd like to think so. The inspiration for Van Helsing remains a topic of debate among scholars. Some theories suggest he was based on some interesting people, including Arminius Vambery and Dr. Johann van der Hoeven. Arminius Vambery was a Hungarian scholar and professor whom Bram Stoker knew personally. Vambery was known for his knowledge of Eastern European folklore. Dr. Johann van der Hoeven was a Dutch scientist and doctor who had interests in the supernatural, which could have inspired Van Helsing's medical background. Let's look more into the influence of Arminius Vambery on Dracula and Van Helsing. One of the most fascinating figures connected to Dracula is Arminius Vambery, a Hungarian scholar, traveler, and Orientalist. Vambery was an expert in Eastern European folklore and had extensive knowledge of regional myths, including those about vampires. Arminius Vambery, 1832–1913, was a Hungarian Jewish Orientalist and linguist. Born in Szent-Györgyi, Hungary, he was a self-taught polyglot who mastered multiple languages, including Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. His deep knowledge of Eastern cultures and folklore made him a renowned scholar across Europe. Vambery's connection to Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker was introduced to Vambery through his employer, Henry Irving, a famous actor. Stoker and Vambery reportedly met in London, where Vambery shared tales from his extensive travels across the Ottoman Empire and Central Asia. His insights into Eastern European and Turkish folklore likely influenced Stoker's depiction of Dracula. Vambery's expertise in vampire myths. Vambery's studies on Eastern European folklore included research on vampire legends. He documented stories about Strigoi, Nosferatu, and other supernatural beings that were believed to return from the dead to prey on the living. His knowledge provided Stoker with a framework for Dracula's background, particularly his Transylvanian origins and mystical abilities. Vambery's knowledge of Ottoman history and their conflicts with Eastern European nations helped shape Dracula's historical connections. His studies of supernatural beliefs in rural Eastern Europe reinforced Stoker's depiction of Dracula as a creature bound by ancient legends. Vambery's accounts of how Eastern European communities perceived outsiders may have influenced Stoker's portrayal of Dracula as a mysterious foreign menace. Although there is no direct evidence that Vambery specifically provided Stoker with the idea for Dracula, his vast knowledge of folklore, combined with Stoker's documented interest in his work, strongly suggests an intellectual connection. Vambery's influence helped shape the novel's depiction of Eastern European vampire mythology, making him a crucial, if often overlooked, figure in the Dracula legend. And now let's move on to Dr. Johann van der Hoeven. What influence van der Hoeven have on vampire myths? Dr. Johann van der Hoeven was a 19th century Dutch physician, scientist, and naturalist with a deep interest in unexplained medical phenomena. Born in the Netherlands, he was a professor of medicine at the University of Leiden and made significant contributions to the understanding of human physiology, pathology, and forensic science. His extensive research into cases of premature burial, misunderstood illnesses, and the physiological causes of rigor mortis made him a pivotal figure in separating superstition from medical science. Van der Hoeven's medical expertise and its relevance to vampirism. Van der Hoeven focused on medical conditions that could have been misinterpreted as vampirism. Some of the conditions he studied include catalepsy, porphyria, tuberculosis, and decomposition. Catalepsy is a disorder that causes a person to enter a trance-like state with rigid body posture and a slowed heart rate. Before modern medical diagnostics, people suffering from catalepsy were sometimes mistaken for dead and subsequently buried alive. Reports of individuals returning from the grave could have fed vampire myths. Porphyria is a group of rare genetic disorders that cause sensitivity to sunlight, receding gums, giving the appearance of elongated teeth, and neurological symptoms. Some historians believe that porphyria may have contributed to the legend of vampires avoiding sunlight. Tuberculosis, or consumption, was widespread in 18th and 19th century Europe. Symptoms include extreme weight loss, pale skin, and coughing up blood, traits that closely resemble the appearance of a vampire's victim. Van der Hoeven studied how bodies decompose and noted that in certain conditions, corpses could appear fresh even weeks after death. This phenomenon, along with reports of blood seeping from the mouth due to decomposition, may have led to accusations of vampirism. While van der Hoeven was a scientist, he was also aware of folklore and superstitions surrounding death. His investigations sought to debunk myths and explain alleged cases of vampirism through medical science. He was particularly interested in how folklore could distort medical facts, leading to mass hysteria and bizarre burial practices. His work likely influenced later scholars and authors, including those who sought rational explanations for vampire legends. Although there is no direct link between van der Hoeven and Bram Stoker, his research contributed to a broader scientific discourse that questioned the supernatural origins of vampires and emphasized medical realities. How does van der Hoeven's work connect to Dracula? Stoker's Dracula presents Van Helsing as a man of science who also acknowledges the supernatural. This duality echoes van der Hoeven's approach of investigating unexplained phenomena while remaining grounded in medical science. Van der Hoeven's studies on premature burial mirror real-life cases where villagers exhumed bodies suspected of vampirism. The scientific interpretation of vampires, influenced by van der Hoeven's work, is seen in modern depictions of vampirism as a disease. Though van der Hoeven may not have been a direct inspiration for Stoker's Van Helsing, his contributions to medical science provided a critical counterpoint to supernatural interpretations of vampirism. His research helped transition vampire lore from a purely mythical origin to one grounded in medical realities, thus shaping how vampires are understood in both historical and fictional contexts. Despite no definitive historical counterpart, Van Helsing remains a crucial figure in vampire mythology, his name synonymous with the battle against the undead. Throughout history, several diseases have been mistaken for signs of vampirism. Before modern medicine, symptoms that seemed unnatural or terrifying were often attributed to supernatural causes. These conditions, misunderstood at the time, contributed to the belief that vampires roamed the earth, feeding on the living. The Dracula legend continues to evolve, blending historical truths, folklore, and modern reinterpretations. Whether seen as a national hero, a monstrous villain, or a tragic anti-hero, Dracula remains one of the most enduring characters in popular culture, ensuring that his shadow looms over literature, film, and media for generations to come. We've reached the end of all things Dracula, at least for now. And that's it for this episode. Thanks for staying with me until the end. Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked this episode, then stay tuned because I've got a lot more upcoming episodes on topics including cryptozoology, folklore, ethnobotany, paranormal phenomena, and much more. If those topics sound interesting to you, then please consider subscribing. Until next time, my friends.